welcome formally to Andy Pflaum and to Magda Marcel, Team Slack, Team Ohio at Slack. So it's so great to have you guys both here. My name is Michael Goldberg, for those who I'm meeting for the first time. I am the executive director of the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship here at Case Western Reserve University, and I'm also the professor of our entrepreneurial strategy undergrad class alongside my colleagues Doug and Megan, who are here. And so a good Andy and Magda, for your background, and anybody who's joining for the community either here on Zoom or live on Facebook, we've got a number of folks that are Case undergrads that are students in our entrepreneurial strategy class, and then we've also opened it up to the community as well. So we're happy to have everyone here. Please use the chat box if you want to ask any questions. And I know, and I'll introduce Victor in a second, who's going to be the moderator. I know Victor also set up, and I'll let him explain, a link for anybody that wants to use Slack to communicate and ask questions during the chat. So sort of 3 ways to ask questions. Those on Facebook, put your questions in the into the Facebook comments, and Doug will bring them into Zoom. Use the Zoom chat or use the Slack channel. So with that, thank you for joining, and I'll turn it over to Victor.
All right, thank you, Michael. And just because we thought it was fitting, Magda helped me create this Slack workspace for everyone to kind of interact with each other and ask questions for Andy. So the channel is called Live Andy Pflaum, and I sent the invite link in the Zoom chat already. So hopefully you all can join us there. So yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm sure we're all eager for some quality content these days. My name is Victor, and I'm a junior finance and economics major at Case. And I have the pleasure of introducing our guest today, Andy Pflaum. He spent more than 15 years in the Valley, having served as the CMO of Zimbra and playing a big role in its scaling to that acquisition by VMware. And then Andy spent some time on the other side of the table before moving to Chile to manage a family winery. And then most recently, he found himself leading Astro to another acquisition by Slack, and that's where you can find him now. So I know, Andy, you spent some time in the Silicon Valley, but before we get to that, I'd love to start with your background at Stanford and then your time at South Africa and kind of how your motivations have changed and led you to the Valley.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Victor, and everybody who's attending today, and to Michael for inviting me. So stepping back, I actually worked with Michael in South Africa before going to Stanford. So after undergrad at University of North Carolina, I worked in Washington, D.C. for a couple years in political campaigns, and then joined an NGO, a non-governmental organization, or nonprofit as we typically call it in the U.S., that focused on democratic development around in other parts of the world. And Michael and I specifically worked in Southern Africa, where there was a lot of change going on, and we helped support the processes of many of those countries becoming increasingly democratized, as opposed to having been sort of in one party rule or dominated by a single political party for many years. Did that for a few years, which is really fascinating. Very motivating to work in environments like South Africa and some of the countries surrounding there. Amazing people, wonderful, beautiful environments, but also troubled and challenging times that they were going through. My experience at that point was largely in the political realm and the non-governmental or nonprofit realm, kind of the civic realm. And I could see that South Africa was going through this transition on multiple facets: their politics, their civil society, but they were also now opening up the economy to 80% of the country that had not previously been allowed to really fully participate in it. They couldn't vote in elections, but they also couldn't really hold the kinds of jobs that could allow them to get ahead and prosper. And they couldn't even get the education that could allow them to do that. And so I didn't know the first thing really about how economies worked, how businesses worked. And so I was interested in going back to school to learn about that. And so I went to Stanford to understand more about business and economies and companies and industries. And so spent 2 years at Stanford in grad school, and coming out of that, became very interested in the startup and entrepreneurial world. Not really as an end unto itself, and I still never, even after 15 plus years of working in the Valley, don't see this as kind of an endpoint where I want to, spend the rest of my career, but really as a very interesting opportunity to learn about how companies grow, how organizations work, how organizations can scale, and how to work and manage in a variety of fast growth environments. And I think those are skills that one can take with them anywhere. So I would, certainly see myself and like to spend latter parts of my career back in the nonprofit or civic or potentially, some elements of the public sector world. And I feel like this is great exposure, training, experience for doing that. So this has kind of brought me, kind of to where I am today, working at Slack after several years of startups and combination of startups and larger companies.
Gotcha.
So I'll pause there. One thing I noted, and Victor, I'll let you moderate and lead the questions. But I know that there are a handful of questions that have come through already around, what is it like to be in a startup company? What's the experience of taking venture capital funding for a startup company versus other options? How is it to go from a startup to a larger company, relatively established company like Slack? Happy to address any of those. And Victor, I'll let you do some of the guidance on those questions.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Andy. So like you mentioned earlier, you've had a lot of experience with NGOs, and you mentioned that this was something that you envisioned yourself kind of ending up at. And before we kind of really dive into the tech world, I did notice you spent some time with the Global AIDS Interfaith Alliance, so another great organization focusing on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and especially with the COVID-19 crisis today. I was wondering how your experience with the GAIA frames the way you view this crisis, and what are some things that you learned from your time there that you think can be applicable to what we're experiencing now?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. So we're obviously all living, this is why we're in this panel of 60 screens all looking at each other. We're in a very different time than we were even a couple months ago with COVID-19, with the need for remote work, the need for social distancing. Let's say the dozens of us who are on this discussion today are probably in about as good of a setting as people can be in the world to deal with this. We're all fairly fortunate to be able to have the connectivity we have. You all are in an education setting, and you're going to use that to springboard to great things after school. Magda and I on here from Slack are well connected in a company that's highly supportive of us in making this transition and provides a tool to support this kind of transition. We all hopefully have good access to healthcare and education about how to take care of ourselves right now. Michael and I had worked in environments in Southern Africa where a lot of those things didn't exist for many of the people that we got to work with or were exposed to. And a personal experience I had when working in Southern Africa was getting malaria, which probably wasn't that uncommon for somebody to be exposed to in that environment. I had the benefit again of being able to get right to kind of first world medical care, get the malaria taken care of within a couple of weeks. I was back on my feet. But I know that a very high percentage of people in the countries where we were working didn't have that kind of access to medical care or the funds, the resources to pay for it if they did. And I was drawn to this organization, Gaia, because it helps serve the considerable percentage of people in countries in Southern Africa who are exposed to HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis on a regular basis, and then in particular periods, they're exposed to additional stresses. Times it's been things like Ebola, or now COVID-19 is going to come into some of those countries where there is a less strong healthcare system, there is less flexibility and less of a safety net for people to be able to, choose to not go to their job. They have no access to be able to do their jobs online. So there's a whole set of conditions that cause additional risks in a lot of those environments. And I'm certainly interested, every day in what are the things that we can do to provide support, tools, resources, education here at home, and then in other environments that can help societies and organizations be stronger in these types of situations. I don't spend daily part of my every day working on things like the Gaia organization that you mentioned, but I did just this morning was excited to see, it was actually reported in some of the entertainment press that Rihanna's foundation, Rihanna, the pop star's foundation, has just given a considerable amount of money to an organization that supports Gaia, and Gaia is getting a big grant from Rihanna's foundation to deliver COVID support through a series of mobile medical clinics in rural Southern Africa. So there's actual, kind of impact going on right now, and some of the things certainly that I care about for how we can extend out some of the safety net, some of the services, some of the support, some of the education and healthcare services that we are fortunate to have access to here in Cleveland, in the Bay Area, across the US, and be able to extend things like that. So that continues for me to be a motivating force in learning about entrepreneurship, learning about how to scale organizations, learning about management, and learning about how to take resources and, where possible, extend those to a variety of environments, and not just kind of traditional business environments here in the US.
Great. So I'd like to just follow your career path, starting at OneBox and then Zimbra. But at OneBox, you were the first business person on the team. And can you talk a little bit more about how you helped OneBox get acquired and how that process looked, and especially how you worked with the team? I know that Roland and Ross have kind of followed you, or you followed them throughout your career, and you've had a lot of experiences with them. So I was wondering how all of that worked together.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a couple commonalities that I think are true for a lot of folks who've spent time in different businesses of different sizes, and I don't think anybody ever has a complete run of success, but hopefully more often than not, you'll have a chance to work in successful companies, and then you'll experience what it's like to not be in a successful company, and hopefully be able to take those learnings on to the next company. And so the couple commonalities I would highlight that you made sort of indirect reference to there are, one, in the Valley and in the tech industry, like in other industries, it is fairly common to have smaller companies that are very innovative, that take risks, that develop new technologies or new business models, become successful with them, and as a result of that, either quickly grow into be bigger companies or join a bigger company and can become sort of an engine or a catalyst within those larger companies. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then the other element is, there are advantages in the people you get to know, the people you get exposed to, the people you work with and you have successes with or common experiences with, and being able through your career to loop back and reconnect with them. Sometimes more less formal way, like the relationship I've had with Michael over the past couple of decades, and being able to join his class over the past few years, even though we haven't worked directly together now in 15 years. That's one level of a relationship. And then the other are a couple of my colleagues you mentioned who I've been in the leadership or co-founded companies with now over the past several years. Some of the investors who have invested in recent companies that I've done were investors in earlier companies or were leaders in earlier companies that I was part of. So those kinds of relationships, can be very important and serve you throughout your career. So just to double click a little deeper on each of those two topics, the ebb and flow of the kinds of and sizes of companies you might work with, I think can be really interesting. So we might be thinking in this context, this discussion about what's it like to be entrepreneurial, what's it like to maybe start a company or to be part of an early stage company. And we might have that as a vision for how we'd spend a lot of our career or the rest of our career. But there are a couple paths that joining startups or being in an entrepreneurial environment can take. One is, that company could be unsuccessful, and that's the most common outcome. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's a very common outcome. And you may have to find yourself at some point leaving that startup company and, getting hired into a larger company because you need that change of environment, or you need that stability. You need the support and the resources for a while. And maybe you do want to get back to an entrepreneurial setting at some point, but you have to choose to change your environment. That's in let's say the less successful case, where personally for you individually or as a startup company, that was not successful. But let's say that startup company is successful, and it could have a couple paths from there. One is it independently grows to become a substantial standalone company. Slack is an example of that. The founders of Slack have obviously grown it up to be a very successful company with many hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, a couple thousand employees, over 100,000 paying customers. So there's kind of no question that Slack is a standalone, independent entity and doesn't have to join up with anybody else to be successful on into the future. Or another middle path is that startup company that you are part of or you create is successful enough to catch the attention and the interest of other companies who want it to join them. And I'd say that's where I've been in a couple companies I've been part of, like OneBox that you mentioned early in my career after business school. Another company called another company called Zimbra that was acquired and became eventually part of VMware. And then the latest company, Astro, which became part of Slack. These are companies that were innovative, had some new ideas, brought together some great people, had a certain degree of success and momentum in order to show some larger companies along the way that some of the things they were going to want to do, they were going to want to accomplish, might actually be better done by acquiring a company like ours and bringing it in. That wasn't our design as a startup, was to go find Slack or go find another company and become part of it. But along the way, that became a natural positive path that we could take because those companies saw what we were accomplishing and wanted to have us join up with them. So that's that one commonality, is ebbing and flowing from spending time in startups, enjoying doing that, finding that a really rewarding and exhilarating experience, but then ultimately wanting to have an impact on a bigger stage, essentially, and being able to join up with companies like VMware at a prior point, like Slack today, to say, look, here's how what we're doing as a startup, what we're doing as a team can have the biggest impact is joining up into these larger companies. And then there are lots of great, a lot of great opportunities and a lot of great experiences in working as part of these bigger companies, which I can talk about more. The second point I said is, you throughout your career, you'll have this opportunity to work with and connect with a variety of people who, even as you leave the company you're in now, you'll then hopefully have that opportunity to continue to work with them in some fashion. You'll come back and work in another company with them. You'll be able to hire them or be hired by them, be funded by them, provide funding maybe someday to a startup or company they're doing, or just have a more less formal interaction and business relationship with them into the future.
Great. I think you covered a lot of really important questions about transitioning from a startup to a larger business and the benefits that come with that. So a question from Marissa Muth. She was asking about the different challenges or obstacles you've potentially faced from transitioning from a leadership role in a smaller company to potentially a much larger company.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's one I think about all the time and I'm asked about fairly frequently is, what's it like to go from leading your own company, smaller company, to joining up with another one? And that's a key question that's often also asked if you're at the point of being considered for an acquisition by a larger company. They want to understand, is your heart going to be in this, joining this bigger company? Is that going to be somehow a letdown for you? Is it going to be a sufficiently different experience that you're not going to enjoy it, you're not going to thrive, you're not going to be motivated, and what impact will that have? For me personally, I've enjoyed working in both environments. The smaller startup, agile, fast-moving one where you have kind of more control of your own, more limited set of resources, and being in larger companies, especially well-run ones. Slack is a very well-run company. I love the people in the company, the founding team, the people who are there today in the company, love the relationships that we have with our customers. So it's relatively easy to enjoy that shift. I've also experienced that in a positive way in an earlier shift, joining VMware, also a well-run company with great people and strong customer relationships. I've seen some element of not necessarily the opposite, but different degrees of that. Been parts of other companies that weren't at least at the top of their game, where it was a little more challenging. And I've observed as other colleagues and friends have joined other companies where that's not the same, and they don't enjoy as much the people they're working with, or the way that company's going, or the relationship that company has with its customers. So that could be a big change. Even in the best of circumstances like this, there's still a lot of differences. I now manage a relatively small team that is part of a bigger team. There are a couple, layers between me and our CEO. I think Magda could say the same. But we could also say that the way companies tend to operate today, and our company does, is we all have a lot of opportunity and a lot of exposure to a lot of the thinking, the decision making, the leadership that goes on. I don't feel separated from our CEO or the other chief team members, the head of sales, the head of marketing, the head of product. I actually feel like I have a lot of access and interaction, exposure to them. And if I need to raise a topic or have a discussion with one of them, I feel like that access exists. I think that's something that's transformed there in the past 10 to 15 years in a lot of companies that makes it easier to work in a large company. And in general, I think large companies are operated better now than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they're better environments to work in. So I actually feel like there is less of a marked difference today between working in a startup and working in many, many large companies. So that's actually made that shift a little easier. I want to actually just insert here one point that has, I think, some tangential relevance to this topic. There's a question Mary posed here in the channel, this live channel discussion, asking about, what's a piece of advice I could provide to somebody at the start of their career? It's been a little while since the start of my career, but I do remember something that I look back on and I think is important if you can do it. I did have this opportunity. It's how I met Michael, to work in the nonprofit sector for a few years. And I worked in political campaigns for a few years right out of school, fairly different than what I'm doing today. I'm really glad I did do that. And I would generally encourage people when they're coming out of school, to the extent you can, try to do the most interesting thing that you can afford to do, essentially. And by interesting, I don't mean necessarily, I don't really mean backpacking in New Zealand or something like that. I mean the work, some motivating work that you could do in a job or in an industry or in a geographical place that you may not be able to do later in life. And for me, that was working in first in Washington, D.C. in political campaigns, and then later in Southern Africa for a nonprofit. Those would be much harder things for me to go do now at this point, with a family, being based in a particular place, being this point in my career. I'm really glad I took the opportunity to do those things earlier on. There were some sacrifices in doing that. I just looked back the other day and saw that I was getting paid at the time what's the equivalent of like a third less than what a college grad comes out today making, like even if you adjust it to today's dollars. So I was making very little money to do that. I was lucky to be able to take that chance and do that. And I understand not everybody can, but generally speaking, to the extent that you can do the most interesting thing you could out of school for a couple of years, I would encourage you to try to do that. You'll have the rest of your career to spend in a traditional business or office environment, whatever that traditional office environment will be post-COVID-19, let's see. But I would encourage people to try to be as creative as you can in your early couple years, because I think it can pay itself off in terms of the experience you get, the exposure you get, the flexibility you have, and the way other people will look at what you've done in your career will be a little different if you've done something more creative, more innovative in those first few years.
Andy, I felt like I saved.
Victor, I'll turn it back.
Andy, I felt like
Michael, thank you.
I saved more money when we were working at NDI making $25,000 a year than I do now.
Hey, how'd you get that deal for 25? I got to go back and talk to them about that. That's pretty good. Yeah, you're right. No, actually, it's true. You can, when you're, and this is actually a good, there's a good analogy there to working in startups is when you are given relatively few resources, you tend to be much more creative with what you do with or without those resources. I've been part of startups that are relatively well funded, and I know it's easier in those cases to say, let's go do the traditional methods. Let's go throw money at the traditional way of building a business or hiring people or marketing things. And the same thing is true in your personal life. When you've got fewer resources at a certain time, you tend to be, probably more creative and more innovative, and that translates as similarly to businesses when you're in a startup.
Thank you, Andy. That was really good advice, and I think it's a good transition into another really unique and interesting experience with your family winery. So we've had some questions from Ariel and Mitch. They were interested about how that experience differentiated from your extensive experience in tech, and kind of whether or not you found that experience more challenging just because it was a whole different side of business. And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that was that again is a little different version of what I was describing in terms of try to do the most interesting thing you could afford to do. And that not only in the first couple of years, but hopefully there'll be other times later in your career where you can do that as well. And for me, this is kind of an example of that. After, a dozen or so years in different tech companies, we, as a family then, tried to take the opportunity to go work in a region where my wife's father had grown up, and the family had a farm there. And to say, look, if we can take a little bit of time off, and I continued to do some professional work remotely while I was there, but I mostly shifted to want to gain exposure to a culture, an environment, and work every day in a language that I wasn't, completely fluent in, and experience a set of business and cultural dynamics that I wasn't fully familiar with from working in tech companies in the US. And so became, for a while there, kind of essentially general manager of the company's, the family's winery. And that brought with it a set of opportunities and experiences that were quite different than what I'd done before. A different culture, a different set of cultural norms and business norms, and even regulations to deal with. If you're familiar with balance sheets and some of the items on a balance sheet, when you work in a tech company, certainly as an employee, you don't spend time dealing often with things like plant, property, and equipment, and managing physical property and equipment, things like that. But those are things that I learned to do, learned to deal with physical inventory that has a certain shelf life to it and expires over time. There are a set of cultural and legal requirements that I had to learn, become familiar with there, including labor laws and norms that are different than we deal with here. And I think that gave me a broader exposure, appreciation, and understanding, because today pretty much all business has some global aspect to it, and increasingly so. And so that was helpful for me to come back from that experience back to the tech world and have those additional facets of knowledge and learning. And it was just refresh and reset as well for that I was able to do. Don't know if I'll be able to do that again at some point in my career, but I would encourage, if you find yourself 10, 15 years into your career and your life situation has changed, and you can take that opportunity, whether it's for a couple months or a year like we did as a family, to try to do that. And I think for our family, it exposed we had three girls who were in primary school at the time, gave them a broader exposure and understanding. And I know Michael did that with his family and going to Vietnam when he was a Fulbright scholar. So there are different ways you can do things like that, not only right away after your start of your career, but maybe even in some cases you have a better opportunity to do those things later on.
Absolutely. Definitely good opportunities for sure. And now I want to shift our focus back to Slack a little bit. I've seen a lot of questions regarding on Slack and how it competes with larger companies like Microsoft and other workplace communications platforms out there already. So how does Slack differentiate from their competitors, and how does Slack succeed in this particular situation that we're in with everyone working remotely?
Yeah, great, thanks. That's a really important question, is when we think about a lot. I wouldn't say we think about it all the time, because I think most companies, most organizations' approach to competition cannot be defined really by the competition. More so needs to be defined by what you're trying to provide in the market, what you're trying to provide to customers. So that the day-to-day, the everyday orientation needs to be, what can I provide that's of most value to my market, to my customers? And one element of thinking about that is, how does it compare against what their other options are? But the defining nature can't be, what is Microsoft providing? What is company X providing? What is company Y providing to my customers? That's just one facet. And our orientation every day is on, what do our customers signal to us, explicitly or implicitly, that they need, and how can we deliver that in the best way for them? If we do that really well every day, then to a great extent, it will take care of our position in the market relative to other competitors. I don't want to overemphasize that. We can completely ignore what others are doing and don't think about it at all. We do have to be conscious about what others are doing. That's why it's a balance where we think about it frequently, but not every moment, every day. What are our competitors doing? Slack is in the fortunate position of having essentially created a new market and defined a new market. We weren't really taking another market and trying to provide just a little bit of improvement or innovation on it. You can be a very successful company doing that. I would say Zoom has succeeded at that. There was already an existing video conferencing market. WebEx was a leader in that, for example. Zoom provided what for many users and customers is a better experience in video conferencing than previously existed. So they took an existing market and innovated on it. So they have probably a different way of thinking about how they go to market than Slack. Slack, for the most part, has created a new market. We think of it as channel-based messaging, a channel-based messaging platform. Channel-based meaning like this channel we have here, this live discussion going on now, or the channel you have for discussing entrepreneurship, or there's a channel for Case Western alums in the Bay Area that all exist in this one workspace. So we think about channels in Slack as themes and topics and projects you talk about together in this channel, in channels that are dedicated to each of those themes, as opposed to traditional methods or email-based methods of communication, which are really your kind of the structure or the format, the foundation of the communication is who are the people in the message and maybe what's the subject line of that message. But otherwise, they're not grouped together well at all. And that's what tends to make the earlier form of communication that businesses ran on email actually quite awkward and not well suited to the variety of ways we work. So Slack saw the email method and said, there's got to be a better way. We think it's this theme-based or this channel-based format for communication, for messaging, and essentially defined a new market on that. And we spend every day thinking about, how do we deliver this channels-based messaging platform to our customers that enables them to do their best work, their best collaboration, their best communication inside their organizations, and as they connect out to other organizations as well. And so our primary focus is, what are we delivering to our customers? What are our customers telling us about how that works for them? What are they telling us explicitly, and what other signals can we read implicitly from how they do their work? And then as one part of that, what are others trying to do in their own products or in products that they've developed that essentially mimic Slack? Microsoft has a product like that, Microsoft Teams. And so we have to be conscious about that. We have to be aware. And I would say much less do we spend our time trying to build things specifically to differentiate from those products. More so, we're going to continue to build what we build. We're going to continue to listen to our customers. As our CEO, Stuart Butterfield, says, we're going to continue to build what any smart, well-informed customer would want us to build. But in our communication about that, in our marketing of that, we'll be clear in pointing out the differences between what we have and what others in the market might have. But that is always driven based on what we understand our customers to need and our customers' feedback to us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know Astro is a very customer-driven company as well. And I've seen a lot of questions from Travis and Shavika. They were wondering how the integration of Astro worked with Slack and how that integration played out into new features that Slack took upon themselves to create, and what new things has Astro provided to Slack?
That's a great question. That's a really important part, I think, of any acquisition is, what exactly is being acquired. And there's a spectrum of acquisitions that happen. And I'll just focus on the tech world, but this is probably true of pretty much any space. And that spectrum could include something where on one end, the acquisition of the company being acquired is really transformative to the company that makes that acquisition. It is such a high impact that it really alters the nature of who that acquiring company is. And not to say that there wasn't much, value in that prior company, but there's just so much in the new acquisition that defines who that new combined entity is. I'm trying to think of some good examples. There are many from the tech world, and maybe I can loop back with some strong examples. Somewhere on that spectrum might be something like Facebook, which was already clearly a industry defining company. When they acquired WhatsApp, and WhatsApp is a major product, and when they acquired Instagram, those are two major products that really influenced who Facebook is today. So they brought in a product into that company that really shaped the nature of who Facebook is today, each Instagram and WhatsApp. Another element of a big transformation is when the acquired company brings in a huge amount of revenue and customers with it, and that influences the direction and the shape of that acquiring company. On the other end of the spectrum is when a company is acquired really just to get some people. Let's say the startup didn't really find traction with their product, but they had smart people who know something about a particular part of the business or technology, and the acquiring company really wants to get those people, and they acquire a group of people, dozens or even more, just to have the talent of those people. And then there's a whole range of companies in between, which is some combination of you want the people, you want something about their technology, you want something about their customer base and relationships. There's something transformative in their technology somewhere in the middle. And I would say I've been in companies that have been anywhere from the middle to the transformative side in joining larger companies. I'd put Astro as kind of in the middle, where we brought 30 people who had a lot of experience and talent and passion for workplace communication and improving workplace communication, and also bringing machine learning to that, how we sort and prioritize that communication. And we brought technology as well into Slack. We also had a product, a specific product. Astro was the name of a product also. We had mobile apps, desktop apps for users. We shut down that specific product upon the acquisition because the way we had that product had its own, as I said, applications, its own clients that end users could use. There wasn't a good way to reconcile that with the existing product that Slack had, the existing apps and clients that users could use from Slack's product. There would just be too much that wasn't reconcilable among those. So we brought the people, we brought all the technology that we had built, and we're able to use that to start building that directly into the Slack product from day one. And so today, Astro is on in the code we brought over and the ideas and the methodology that we bring into the Slack product. And specifically, Slack now has a degree of integration with email and with calendar that it didn't have prior to acquiring Astro. And it has 30 plus people who came across who are working on that every day. Now we've also extended the work we do and the areas we work on to things in file management, like with Google Drive, calls, like with our integrations with services like Zoom, and our own Slack calling capabilities that we provide. And in other areas of Slack as well, the team works on providing those integrations, but it started with this technology that we brought over as part of that acquisition, and the 30-ish people that we brought as part of that acquisition.
Got it. And another interesting question from Antonio, switching gears a little bit towards raising capital. And I know that you've had a lot of experience with that over many different startups, but his question was, how do startups handle the challenges of being long-term focused while some VCs are investing in that startup with shorter timelines and may be more interested in a return on investment?
That's a great question. I would say a couple things. First, today in the Silicon Valley type tech environment, I think most companies have certain pressures to move relatively quickly, whether you're venture funded or not. And one of the key factors of that is the availability of talent. Some of the best folks don't want to just sit in a relatively static company for long periods of time. They tend to realize that their inputs to a company can be valuable, can provide leverage to that company, and they'd like to see that company grow and be successful. And if they're at a company that's static and not really growing a lot, many talented, motivated people are going to want to move on to another company that is moving, growing fast, innovating. And that's true whether you're in a venture funded company or not. So that dynamic exists in a lot of markets, in the technology market, certainly here in the Bay Area, as well as many other parts of the country where there's a competition for talent. It can be compounded or accelerated by the presence of venture capital funding. I would say venture capital funding isn't inherently impatient. It can be patient if they're seeing growth and if they're seeing success. Where kind of no funder, venture capital otherwise, generally is going to be content is to be putting money into something and then not see innovation or growth or success. Venture capital funding, they're going to be reluctant to see their funding used and dissipate, or to see it run out, or to see people coming back asking for more if they're not seeing growth, progress, innovation, and signs of success in that company. But when they are seeing those signs, they can be very patient. And they can be patient in terms of being willing to let you go for a while on that growth rate, being willing to see you go out and raise more capital from them and other investors. A great example that exists today, maybe a hallmark example, is the payments technology company, Stripe. Stripe was founded 11 years ago now. I think it took its first funding 10 years ago. Probably first traditional venture funding 8 or 9 years ago, I suppose. And I think I just saw today, they've raised another $600 million on top of the last $250,000 that they raised a few months back. They're now valued at something like $36 billion in the private markets. They're not public yet. And they've shown a lot of patience in not going public. Going public would be one of the best ways for venture capital funders to get paid out when their company goes public. But their investors are clearly showing patience with this company, Stripe, because Stripe has grown at a great pace, has shown great success in the market. And I think their investors are probably quite patient to see them continue to stay private for now over this, almost dozen years that they've existed, maybe, 8 or 9 years of under venture funding, because they've shown that great progress and that great growth. So that's an example where the capital is willing to be patient and put in more and more capital along the way. They've also been able to retain great talent through those years because they've shown their growth, their innovation, and their success. And if they or any other company here in the Bay Area aren't showing that kind of growth. Any other, no, not any, but many other technology companies here in the Bay Area or in other markets can't show that kind of growth. They're going to start to see too much turnover of the talented team members and face challenges there.
Yeah, touching on that idea of patience, both for investors and the founders leading the company, we're seeing a lot of disruptions from COVID-19, and this is a question from Mandy. Are there a lot of opportunities for companies like Slack or other fast-moving startups to take advantage of a void in a industry or space where they can create products or services that haven't existed before and probably are showing a need, especially during a time like this?
Yeah, that's great. Very good question. I think it's very relevant. We spend a lot of our time right now as a business thinking about how do we show the capabilities of Slack that are so relevant in this period under COVID-19, where everyone is kind of working and learning and teaching from home, from remote circumstances. We actually feel really good that Slack as a tool has always been built for agile teams and groups to work from. But we also haven't felt that we could evangelize a particular way of working. Up until a couple months ago, most companies only knew pretty much one way of working, which was the majority of their people working in offices. Some people maybe working remotely some of the time. But that model was something that was unlikely to change in any quick period without this kind of a catalyst, which most of us did, of course, did not see this catalyst coming. But there are certain tools that lend themselves well to, because they're very good for agility, for organizations that are having to make quick changes and stay connected and stay working and communicating well. We think Slack is one of those that's naturally good for that. We never tried to evangelize that, hey, companies should go remote. That would just be pushing a message that people weren't ready for up to a couple months ago. But now that people have been forced into this new context, we want to make sure people understand how they could use Slack. Companies and users understand how they could use it. So we've had a whole series of, it's not as though we're building a bunch of new features to accommodate this. The features essentially already exist in the product. We're highlighting how teams, how companies, how institutions can use Slack, and can use Slack in combination with other technologies like Zoom. I, for example, joined this Zoom call not from my Google Calendar or from finding a link in my email. I joined the Zoom call directly from the calendar reminder that came to me in Slack. I didn't leave Slack in the 30 minutes prior to this meeting. What popped up to me inside Slack was a reminder about this meeting and a link right there, a button to join directly into this Zoom meeting. So it's an example of how we're able to continue to work seamlessly, even though I'm not in an office or we're not all meeting in a classroom. And Slack is making that very easy for me to be able to do. We're talking about this all the time. I did a webinar yesterday for a few hundred attendees from different universities about how Slack can be used in the higher education setting. Actually, one of the great examples of how it's being used in higher education today is Arizona State University, a very large state university who's got a very visionary chief information officer who actually was the chief information officer previously at Case Western, somebody that Michael knows well, Lev Gonik. And there are examples, great examples of how universities have made the shift to online learning and teaching through tools, of course, like Zoom, also like Slack. There are thousands of universities who use Slack for their online teaching, learning, and administration of their universities. And we have a similar message, of course, for our 100,000 plus customers who are not in education institutions who use Slack, how the tool can be used to support this new world of remote working today and the immediate point we're at. But we also think it's going to transform how many companies and organizations and institutions work, even when we're hopefully sooner than later out of the immediate crisis pandemic period.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And as we're starting to wrap up, Lawrence is asking a really great final question I think we can end on. And he's asking about a failure that you've experienced in your career that may have been a key turning point or transformed the way you thought about different startups and companies and other things you've been working on?
Yeah, I'd say that thank you. I like that question. One other thing I'll say before we wrap is I'll try to, if I get the chance in the next day or so, to go in and provide some notes on some of the other great questions that have been in channel that we haven't had a chance to talk about directly. So please, if you can, stay tuned to that channel, and I'll try to address the other ones in there. I'd say the thing I look back most on my career and regret or feel like I learned from is circumstances. I can think of one in particular, but there have been a couple others where I worked with people that I didn't enjoy working with. Sometimes that's individuals, sometimes that's the overall environment in a team or a company. And, we don't all have complete discretion to choose the job we do, or exactly what that job is like, or choose exactly who the team is. So I'm not suggesting you can just hop around until you find the perfect thing with ease. But there have been times where I've spent longer period working with where I wasn't positively motivated by the teams and the individuals I was working with. Didn't feel like that was a positive experience where we were collectively setting a great tone for the organization. And when I stepped out away from those, I was really glad to have done that. Sometimes you can change that yourself. Sometimes you can influence that highly, and other times you can't. And in the cases where I couldn't have sufficient influence to change that, I feel like I may have gone too long. So in the slow boiling pot of water. And so I think you have to be honest with yourself. Is this role I'm in, does this bring the best out of me? Am I doing the best I can? Am I providing the best leverage for other people around me, the best motivation and inspiration for them? And when that's not the case, and you can't change it sufficiently, I think looking where you're able to for a better environment, a better opportunity makes sense. And times I haven't done that fast enough is where I've kind of looked back and said, well, at least I've learned from that. I wish I'd done it sooner.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And just to echo what you mentioned, I think live Andy Pflaum Slack channel will be a great place for people to follow up with you and for you to look over some of the questions that we may not have covered today. And with that, I'll hand it back to Michael.
Great. Thanks, Victor. And Victor, thanks for doing such a great job moderating. It's really with great pride and a lot of fun to watch our students in this class, and we've had others that haven't been in the class moderate these sessions. And today we added a new element. So Victor was checking the Slack channel, Zoom. We had some questions come in from Facebook. So Victor, thank you for masterfully moderating. It was great. It was great. Thank you for doing that. Andy, thank you for taking the time. It's interesting on a lot of what we talk about. And again, this is a mix of both students at Case and folks from the outside. A lot of the students at Case in this undergrad class that are taking an entrepreneurship course, some of them for the first time, aren't necessarily planning on going directly into entrepreneurship right out of university. A number of our folks, particularly some of our engineering students, have jobs that they've already accepted in larger companies. But this kernel of perhaps sort of in the back of their mind that you can take a journey that may have different twists and turns. I mean, I think about you and I doing this work in South Africa in our 20s. What ended up happening, and Andy and I know this well, because some of the friends from this nonprofit went to business school with us. Like, there was probably like almost 10 or 15 of us all doing nonprofit work that all went and got MBAs, and then a number of us ended up in sort of technology startup fields. And I think if you had asked us at the time we were doing this work, if we would have ever envisioned that we would be working in startups or venture capital, we may not have even known what that was. But it is interesting how these, you do things that you're passionate about, you get these experiences. So I think a lot of the advice that you shared today on your career journey and what you've enjoyed, I think it's really timely for our students. So thank you. And you've been kind to do class with us a couple times and host a group of students when we came out to Slack, you and Magda, in the fall, which was great. So thanks for being a great partner and friend, and best to your family.
Thank you very much, Michael, for having me. Thank you, Victor, for that great moderating. And I appreciate this opportunity, and glad to have Magda as our ongoing alum point of connection as well.